We know in today's world we're living in a kind of modern life, and we know that modernization just had a history about 300 years ago. 300 years ago, we have a first wave of modernization happening in Western Europe, involving about 40 million people. And then at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, we have second wave of modernization led by United States, Japan, and Soviet Union, involving about 400 million. Nowadays, we have China, India, and other countries in the Asian Pacific leading the third wave of modernization, involving almost 4 billion people. And we also know that the previous two waves of modernization was achieved through massive industrialization, which means a massive consumption of natural resources and rapid urbanization. And everybody here knows that we cannot achieve or finish the third wave of modernization the old way, because if everybody lives a life like this, Chinese, Indians, Indonesians, Malays, we're all doomed before we even get in there. So therefore, corporations have to find a way to revolutionize industrialization in which we can maximize our natural resources but minimize the bad impact. On the other hand, the government, of course, will also find a way to lead this kind of new wave, new models of modernization, so that we can really sustain our development well without just using up or damaging entirely our environment. We're privileged and very lucky to have Mr. Balkenende here to give us a lecture on this exact very important topic. We know that Mr. Balkenende was Prime Minister of Netherlands from 2002 to 2010, and he's now a renowned professor and a leading expert, try to promote a new way of developing our economy to sustain the development and also, of course, to optimize resources available to us. Please join me to welcome Mr. Balkenende.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back in Singapore. Maybe it's good to say something about my backgrounds, and I really can say I love Singapore, and it has to do with the following. My brother lived in Singapore in the 80s for 6 years, and he was very successful in business, but also in his personal life he was successful. He married a Singaporean. I remember the time when I was for the first time here in Singapore, and I was there with my youngest brother, and the three of us, we were walking in the Jurong Bird Park. You know it, of course. And it was warm, and the sun was shining. It was so hot. And then my youngest brother said, it's better to be a tropical fish than a tropical bird. And we agreed with him. Since then, I must say, I'm in love with Singapore. I like it. I like the people. And your story, the story of Singapore, is really a fascinating story. Compare what Singapore was 50 or 60 years ago and what it is now. I think you can say that Singapore is a model for the world. So it's always good to be back in Singapore. I was 4 times in the 80s. I was here in my capacity as Prime Minister. I had a good personal understanding with Prime Minister Lee. Since I'm in the business sector, my most important job is being partner corporate responsibility at EY, an audit firm. And since 2011, I've been here several times. It's always good to be with you, to be here in Singapore. And today, it's about our future, as the professor already pointed out. So many things are on our agenda. And it's good to say something about the content of my speech. I have a disappointment for you. I don't have slides or PowerPoint. Do you mind? A little bit disappointed? Thank you very much. That means I have to say something about the content of my speech, and Ambassador, it's fantastic you're here. I know you're a very busy man, Mr. Werner, so it's great that you've taken the time to be with us. Appreciate it very much. Let's say when you've been Prime Minister, you always like those British television series. And maybe you heard about it, one that's called Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. And you know it's a very beautiful series. And one day the Prime Minister received a draft text for a speech, and he read the text and he reread the text, and then he said to his advisor, but it has no content. And then the advisor replied, thank you for the compliment, Prime Minister. So I have to say something about the content of my speech. I intend to make remarks about 3 points. First point, that's completely in line with what you've said, the huge importance of sustainability at the moment, now and in the future. That's remarks about sustainability and its consequences for businesses, NGOs, universities and governments. That's the first point. The second point, that has to do with the issue of innovation, sustainability and the role of innovation. And of course I will say something about my experiences in my country. And the third, and that's the combination of these two, that's about leadership. Sustainability and leadership, because I think we have to change things. And then we can draw some conclusions. So that's what I intend to do. Making remarks about the key importance of sustainability, the second about innovation, and third about leadership. Do you agree with these 3 points? Yes. It's okay? Did I miss anything? Let's do it in that way. So this was a moment of interaction in my speech. But let's start with a question to you. Who is involved in sustainability issues? You are. What are you doing? Wait a moment, I'll come to you. I'm very flexible.
I curate the Future Centre here in Singapore, which is a platform where we analyse change and look at the implications of that change for the future and sustainability of particular sectors.
Yeah, so you're completely involved in it. Others? Thanks, yeah, you?
I was working in an energy policy think tank in India.
Yeah, energy policy thinking. What do you think about the energy policy here in Singapore?
I don't know much about it actually.
You could be a politician. You could be a diplomat. So I think this is the right answer. No, I have to learn more about it. And moreover, if people need your advice, then they can come to you. That's true. So there's other examples. Yeah, what are you doing?
I do the research on the sustainable development in rural China.
Yeah.
Use the internet and e-commerce, how they improve the lifestyle and the local sustainable knowledges can impact the urbanization in China.
Yeah, so it's your response. Others? No, you will be the last one, because I have to say something here, so, and your role.
I work for a business network that is trying to look at how CSR and sustainability issues can be a part of the ASEAN integration agenda.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, 4 examples of what it means if you are active in the sphere of sustainability. Let me go back to a very well-known film. Who of you have seen the film of Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth? Some of you. Maybe you remember the film that you could see the pictures of the Alps, the mountains in Europe. You can see the pictures of 100 years ago and now. And what you can see is that the ice caps have melted completely or partly. But it was 100 years ago and now. I've seen also another film. The film was called Chasing Ice. Have you seen it? I think nobody can imagine it. I've seen it in the Free University in Amsterdam. And that is a film about the cameraman. He installed cameras in Iceland, Greenland and Alaska. And that was not 100 years ago and now, that was between 2006 and 2009. And if you put these pictures behind each other, then you get a film. And then you can see that pieces of ice, as big as Manhattan, but 2 or 3 times as high, disappeared in 3 years' time. I think many of you have probably been in Beijing. I've been in Beijing when the sky was blue. It had rained, blue sky, you could see the mountains. If you are for 2 or 3 days in Beijing, suddenly the dust is coming up and you can see that the air is polluted. You know the issue of the plastic soup in the ocean. So much plastic is in our oceans. We will have a world population of 9 billion people, and these people have to be fed. So many things are on our agenda, and what I think is that we can see that our world is changing, and if we're not aware of the risks in the future, we get big difficulties. We talk about the issue of climate change. The prediction is now that we will have an increase of the world temperature by 4 or 5%. Whereas people say it must not be more than 2%. That's the point. So it's a big risk if we are waiting with taking the right actions. So I'm concerned about 9 billion people who have to be fed, and if you aren't changing our ways of producing things, then we get big difficulties. So we have the issue of climate change, world temperature, we have the issue of 9 billion people, we have the issue of the scarcity of natural resources. It's all on our agenda. And the longer we wait, the higher the price will be in the future. That's what we know. So if you would see the documents of the United Nations, the OECD, and all the other institutions, it is clear what sustainability is all about. It's about environmental issues, climate change. It's about energy efficiency, the renewables. It's about human rights. It's about the relationship between you as a company and your employees and society. It's about integrity and transparency. It's about creating jobs for those who have some difficulties. All these elements are part of sustainability. And where you are in the world is high on the agenda. When I was in Japan as Prime Minister, I attended a lot of companies, and what I noticed is that a lot of these companies, they were talking about what are the values of our company. And I noticed that a lot of these companies spoke about sustainability as one of the values of the company. Usually it was also linked to the family character of those businesses. And I was in Korea, in South Korea, I noticed, and you know South Korea 60 years ago, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And today it's a country with a winning mentality. And they've chosen for green growth. You will see that, the Global Green Growth Institute. The fact that a country like South Korea, with a winning economic mentality, connects that with the world of the green growth is an important issue. And I was here in Singapore in 2011. Also, I was invited by Temasek. And there was the launch of a new center that was called the Stewardship and Corporate Governance Center. And I spoke with the director, I said, why do you have this Stewardship and Corporate Governance Center? And he said, all our directors of Temasek are taking daily decisions on investments, and they must be able to lay the connection between investment decisions on the one hand and sustainability on the other hand. In Europe, many companies are talking about sustainability, so it's in the mind of everyone. But the question is, are we doing enough? And Professor, if you would ask me, the discussion about CSR, that's there for decades, that's true. When I was a student, we have the same age. When I was a student, I had to read books with titles like Management is More, about the social responsibility of the entrepreneur. I defended my PhD thesis in 1992, Government Regulation and Non-Governmental Organizations, and 1 year later I became a professor at Free University in Amsterdam, and I was preparing my lecture, my inaugural lecture. I was in the United States, and the Americans are fantastic in book titles. The Third Wave, Power Shift, Megatrends. And I was in a bookshop and I saw a book with the title, The Fourth Wave, Doing Business in the 21st Century. I thought I must have that book. And everything that's on the agenda now was already written down in that book. So the discussion is there for decades, but the question is, what has really changed? I will mention 4 points, but the first element I would like to mention is the point, when you are talking about the role of businesses, what are the new elements? Let's go back to 1970. Maybe you've heard about Milton Friedman, the famous management guru. In 1970, he said, the business of business is business. You have to act in the right way, you have to respect the rule of law, you have to do things in a polite way, but the business of business is business. Today, it is, as Michael Porter said, of the Harvard Business School, it is about creating shared value. A company is there to realize economic value, otherwise you cannot invest, you cannot keep people employed. But at the same moment, it's about creating social value. What are you doing to fulfill the needs and wants of society? And how can you integrate economic and social value? It's a new concept of the corporation. So, not the business of business, business, no, creating shared value, that's one. The second new element is you are not acting alone as a company. If you want to reach more in the sphere of sustainability, you have to talk about the whole value chain. That means if you are buying natural resources, the question is, how have these resources been produced? Was child labor involved or not? What are the labor conditions? What about the role of CO2 emissions in your production process? What about your suppliers? What are they doing? You all know the company of IKEA, I suppose, a Swedish company. It's a really sustainable company. But they say for us, what is really important is wood and cotton. So the key question is, how are wood and cotton being produced? So it is about being aware that in the whole value chain everything must be okay. That's one. And the second point is, as a company you cannot change everything. You have to work together with others. So that's the world of alliances. More and more you can see that companies are working together with others. Let me give a concrete example. Unilever. You all know Unilever, a famous company. It's considered to be a sustainable company. They have a sustainability strategy, and that's called Sustainable Living Plan. When they had a first year evaluation, that was not an internal event, it was an event for all the partners in the value chain, but also other companies were invited, NGOs were invited, government officials were invited, and academic people from universities. And that was a kind of stakeholder approach. Let's talk with others about your performances. And more you can see it's necessary to work together with others, otherwise you cannot change things rapidly enough. So that's the world of the alliances. And the third component, that has to do with long-term thinking. We all know what happened in 2008, the financial crisis in the US. This was not only a financial crisis, it was also a moral crisis. With obscure financial techniques, perverse bonus systems, with strange stimuli, and with taking big risks, and we've seen the results. That had to do also with the fact that people were focusing on making profits in the short run. Quarterly, you must be able to show the results. Today, more and more people do understand that it is about long-term thinking. That's what you can see. I'm happy that more and more companies are talking about long-term aspects. Another question, is CSR new or not? I think there are 4 new elements in the discussion about CSR. The first is about economic growth. When I studied, like you, in the 70s, beginning of the 80s, we had a report of the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. Maybe you've heard about that report. In those days, people said, if you have economic growth, it will lead automatically to more pollution, to environmental damage. And that was the reason why people said, you must have limits to growth. Today, I think the discussion has changed. It's not about limits to growth, it is about sustainable growth. You can grow, but if you want to grow, it must be done in a sustainable way, taking into account CO2 elements, energy elements, human rights issues, etc. And I think growing is part of human nature. If you're a sportsman, you want to, of course, you want to reach the gold medal at the World Championship or at the Olympic Games. And an entrepreneur wants to discover new markets. A researcher wants to realize the best results. I think growth is part of human nature, but not at any cost. And maybe we've forgotten that in the past. So the discussion of growth has changed. Second point that has changed, that is, I'm going to go back to 2011. I became partner at EY, at Ernst & Young. I met an American, and he said, oh, that's nice, you've been Prime Minister, what you do now? I'm saying, partner at EY. He said, oh, and what are you doing? I said, I'm partner in corporate responsibility. Ah, that's nice. We do a lot in the sphere of corporate responsibility. And of course my question was, and what are you doing? And what do you think? What would be the reply? Have you an idea? You have any idea? Exactly, philanthropy. He said, we give money to charity. And of course there's nothing wrong with giving money to museums, cancer research, hospitals. But the question is not giving back. The key question is, how have you reached your profits? That's the point. And if you have reached your profits in a non-sustainable way, not talking about human rights, not talking about environmental issues, then the story of giving back is not such a nice story. And today we see that if you want to perform in a sustainable way, it is about integrating sustainability into your business model and strategy. Let me give an example. Have you ever heard about Interface? That's a carpet production company in the US. It's a nice story. What happened in the 70s, Ray Anderson started his carpet factory. And he was very successful. Every year, the turnovers increased, the profits increased. And after 20 years, he received the invitation to give a speech about his economic success. And that was the moment when he started rethinking his own business. He said, indeed, in the American context, I'm very successful. Constantly, I have an increase of my turnover and profits. And then he started to ask himself the question, how have I reached my profits? Have I been thinking about environmental issues, violation of human rights, energy issues, and all these things? He said, no. And that was the moment he said, I have to rethink my business model. So if you talk about doing the right things in the sphere of sustainability, it is about redefining your strategy, your business model, your key performance indicators, etc. That's the second component. The third one has to do with the business case. I know your observation, Professor, but we've seen in the past the development when the economy went up, you could see an increase in the tension for CSR issues. But if the economy slowed down, when we had the financial crisis, then suddenly the tension faded away. That was the traditional pattern. Today, more and more we can see the opposite. That's interesting. Today you can see that businesses who have a long-term view, who have an eye for what's necessary in the future, they are starting to rethink their business models, and we have more and more proof that you can be profitable when you act in a sustainable way. From time to time I'm referring to Professor Eccles of the Harvard Business School. He did an analysis on American companies, 180 in total, and he compared 90 what he calls high sustainability companies with 90 low sustainability companies. And what happened? And that was in the research between 1993 and 2010. So not a few years, 70 years time. And the outcome of this research was that the high sustainability companies had a better performance, a better return on investment, a better position on the stock market, a better reputation than the low sustainability companies. Last year there was a discussion in The Guardian, a British newspaper, about the question, can sustainability be profitable? And there were references to 50 studies that underlined that it can be profitable. But of course you have to rethink your strategy, your methods, your products, etc. It is possible. So I had a nice experience in New York. The ambassador is here, and when I was in New York, of course I want to thank the ambassador and all the members of the team at the United Nations, our embassy over there, just to thank them for what they've done for me and the other ministers. So we said, okay, let's have a dinner together. And we went to a restaurant that was called Rouge et Tomate, red tomato. And it was a Dutch manager. It was nice, and I said to him, it was 2009, September 2009. And when I entered that restaurant, I said, hey, but this is a new restaurant. And of course I knew about so many restaurants in New York, they suffered because of the financial crisis. They had no clients, because of the bankruptcy of banks, etc. And I said, hey, this is remarkable, you have a new restaurant. How come? Since how long do you exist? He said, since 1.5 years. I said, so? You started your business when the financial crisis started in New York? That's remarkable. Yeah, but he said, we have another business model. I said, what is it? He said, we are a sustainable restaurant. All our food has been produced in a sustainable way. The wines we're serving have been produced in a sustainable way. We have another policy regarding energy issues or waste. And the good thing was that he was rethinking the concept of a restaurant, and then people liked that idea, and he was very competitive. Whereas other restaurants suffered, he showed that it's possible to do things another way. It's only one example, and I can give many more. So that's the issue of the business case. And then the fourth element, you can have the best intentions. You can have the best plans. But the question is it an honest story? What about measurement and reporting? If you say, we are a sustainable company, yes, we want to reduce our CO2 emissions. But if you don't have key performance indicators to really bring them down, then it's a nice story, but without significance. The question is, what about measurement? What about reporting? What about your key performance indicators? What about the willingness to report about the results? And that's what you can see more and more. It is the content on the one hand. I attended the conference of the OECD some years ago in Paris. The content was greening global value chains. That is the content, the changing of the value chains on the one hand. And the other item on the agenda was measurement and reporting. So that's the fourth component. Having said all this, let me be a bit practical and say something about an initiative in my country, in the Netherlands. I'm chair of that initiative, so I know a little bit about it. And that's called the Dutch Sustainable Growth Coalition. Maybe Do I speak too quickly? Sometimes people in the Netherlands are criticizing me because you speak too quickly. So if you have any remark, please make that remark, and otherwise I will go on. Okay. Yeah? No? Okay. Other remarks? Okay. Then the Dutch Sustainable Growth Coalition, as an example. What happened? I stopped as Prime Minister in October 2010. EY invited me to become partner at the company. And I have a good friend, that's Paul Polman, he's the CEO of Unilever. And he invited me to have a breakfast meeting. And then we discovered something. We said it's remarkable that several Dutch companies have a #1 position on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. A lot of Dutch companies have a strong profile in the sphere of sustainability. Unilever itself is now a #1 position on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. The chemical company AkzoNobel, or DSM. KLM is also one. Philips. And then we said, in fact, we have a responsibility as companies to work together. Let's start with a new initiative, and that's called the Dutch Sustainable Growth Coalition. A coalition of 8 multinationals who are all busy in the sphere of sustainability. And then we said, it's so important to learn from each other what all these stories means for the development of new business strategies. How can you integrate sustainability into business models? Well, how can we learn from each other? That is what we call SHAPE. SHAPE means shaping new views on business models. The second one was share. Talk about it with other companies. That's the reason why when we have meetings, sometimes we have internal meetings, but a few weeks ago we had a meeting with the Dutch Prime Minister, another minister, and afterwards we had a meeting in the building of the Dutch Employees Association, and we had a meeting with 30 or 35 CEOs of other companies. Share, talk about with others. And the third was stimulate the debate. We've written 3 reports, you can download it on internet. The first report was about sustainable growth business models. What do we mean by these models? There are different phases. The first is, of course, compliance. You are acting in the right way, you are respecting the rule of law, but in fact it's not so creative. The second step is risks and opportunities. That's a step further. And the third one, and that's the most important one, that's of course strategic sustainable value creation. And that means you have to rethink the whole model of thinking, rethinking your business strategy, the products, etc. That was the theoretical framework. Let me give some concrete examples. DSM. DSM is a chemical company. They are receiving prize of the United Nations because of their contribution to the work of the World Food Program of the UN, because of their nutrients production. That's one example. Heineken. It's always good to talk about beer, although it's a bit early now. Heineken is active everywhere in the world. In Africa, they have the policy of local sourcing. That means that they say in 2020, 60% of the grains needed for the production of beer must be produced locally. Why? Less transport, less environmental pressure, less CO2 emissions on the one hand, and more economic opportunities for the local farmers on the other hand. That was an example of Heineken. KLM, another example. They started with an initiative of using biofuels in planes. Of course, planes are polluting, that's clear. But in any case, they say we have to think about everything, so let's use in any case another type of fuel. So, and of course, it's only a start, but in any case, it was a start. Our second report was about how can you embed this new way of thinking in your own organization. Leadership and corporate governance aspects. Let me give some examples. If you want to change the views of your company, the insights, the strategies, of course it's important what is the tone at the top. What's the CEO saying? What is the CFO? What is the COO? What's the top of the organization saying about this new business model or this new business strategy? Another element is, what is the role of the non-executive members of the board? Are they only talking and analyzing the financial performance of a company? Or are they also talking about the social and ecological performance of the company? Another element is remuneration. A company like AkzoNobel, the chemical company, their bonus are related to their position on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So they have an impulse for the people, a stimulus for the people to be active in the sphere of sustainability. Regarding the implementation strategies, I said that the remuneration system, you can try to find out the financial stimuli. That's also a good one. Another element is the willingness to report about your results. I work in the world of auditors. The future of auditing will be integrated reporting. An auditor will not only analyze the financial performance of a company, but also the social performance of a company. And you will see that these financial and socio-ecological elements will be integrated. So integrated reporting is a financial technique, but it will only be successful if you've chosen for an integrated thinking, if you've chosen for an integrated approach, a more holistic approach as a company. So all these elements you will find in our second report. The third report was about sustainable innovation. And our question was, we have an extremely important year, this year, 2015. Within a few weeks' time, and already now, heads of government will talk about the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. That's in September now. And in the beginning of December, we'll have the climate summit in Paris. It's all about climate change. And our question was, what can companies contribute to these important elements? I'm convinced the Sustainable Development Goals will never be met. You will never realize them without the support of the private sector. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, we will never reach those goals without the private sector. And then the question is, how can companies contribute to those issues? SDGs and climate change. Let me give some examples. AkzoNobel is producing coatings for ships. Their coatings make it much easier to clean the ships. But also you can have a higher speed with the same amount of energy, or the same speed with a lower amount of energy. Now this is a different matter. How can you integrate things? Heineken, they are together with others, they produce their fridges that use 80% less energy. DSM, another chemical company, they are producing coatings for solar panels that makes these panels much more efficient. You know, there's always the problem of reflecting the sun, but if you can absorb the sunlight in a better way, that makes these panels more efficient. So that's what DSM is doing. Friesland Campina, dairy products. They have so much knowledge about feeding people here in Southeast Asia. And they also are aware of the risks when you don't have the right feeding programs in the country. And in Indonesia, they are busy with microfinance projects for farmers over there. I can give many, many examples. It is possible to do things in another way, but there must be the willingness to think about it. How can we contribute? And of course you can say, yeah, but yeah, Peter, these are big companies, these are multinationals, they have the financial means, etc. What I see in my country is that all the bigger companies, they all have a sustainability policy. I think you will be the loser if you've not chosen for sustainability. I'm convinced being successful in the future is about having an entrepreneurial spirit, the willingness to be innovative, and choosing for sustainability. If you miss one of these components, I think you can forget it. It's key to underline that. And I see it among, in any case, the large corporations. Our SMEs in my country, 60% of the SMEs are involved in it. In any way, more or less, in any case, 60%. And the family business is even higher, there's more than 90%. And the question is, why should these family businesses choose sustainability? And you can already know the answer. Family businesses are always connected with society. And family business, they have a long-term character. It's not about your revenues or your profits, no, it's about the conditions under which next generations can go on their function. That's a bit of point. This is about the story of the corporations, the NGOs. What I see in my country is sometimes there has been a time that the NGOs were criticizing corporations or criticizing the government. We see a development of a new strategy in which the NGOs are working together with companies. I already mentioned Unilever. When they talk about their sustainability strategy, they have discussions with NGOs, even with the critical ones. Unilever is talking with Greenpeace. In my country, there is an energy agreement between the government, businesses and NGOs. And the question is, how can we strengthen the renewables in the Netherlands? Beautiful example of how you can work together. It also leads to new roles for government. Are governments willing to cooperate with others? Are you part of a network? I think many things can be done if there's the willingness to rethink everything. Your strategy, your products, your services, the way of cooperation with others. So this is about the world of sustainability, and I'm really convinced it will be high on the agenda. We are running out of time, we have to do it, we need the private sector. That's the first point I would like to make. The second point has to do with innovation. Because if you talk about sustainability and redefining your business models, this is also of course connected with the world of innovation. Let me go back to time when I was Prime Minister. I started in 2002, and we were a bit working behind in Europe. That was the reason why we said we have to reform our social security system, pre-pension facilities, health. We have to realize savings, but at the same moment we want to do more in the sphere of innovation. So that's the reason why we start with an innovation platform. And we discovered that we have a big problem in my country. Companies like Philips, Shell, Unilever, Heineken, they are investing a lot in R&D. But the problem is the SMEs, in fact, they are not using the knowledge of universities, etc. Then we said we must have an instrument that SMEs are able to use the knowledge of universities and others. And we call that innovation vouchers. So we gave stimuli, subsidies to the companies to use the knowledge of universities. It was a huge success. That's the first one. The second instrument was, in the pre-competitive phase, sometimes it's better to work together. So can you have innovation contracts between companies so that together you can do research, you can use it, and afterwards you can have the competition. I think in 26 sectors we worked with this phenomenon. I think it was good. Another component was the knowledge workers. If you would attend the laboratories of Shell or Philips, you will see 70% are from abroad and 30% are Dutch. So we need people from other countries. But sometimes the procedures are too long. We also said, we are a gas producing country. Let's use financial means of the gas production for more R&D activities. We had creative ideas. We said it's not only a matter to have an innovation platform in the Hague, we also have regional platforms. So we saw them in Utrecht and Eindhoven and other places. And it created a lot of enthusiasm and energy. We also had complete new ideas. There was one guy, he said, we must show how good we are in offshore activities. So he had the idea to have a tulip oil in the North Sea. Everyone in the world talked about the tulip oil in the North Sea. And of course that will never be realized, but it was a symbol that we can do many offshore activities. I think it was fascinating to talk about innovation, to take practical steps. And at this moment you can see that things are changing. We start also with the key areas, and now it's called top sectors. In which sectors you're strong, use that. In my country, for example, we're very strong in agriculture, agri-food. We have only 70 million people, but we are the second exporter of agriculture products after the US. How come? This is indeed about innovation. We have a fantastic university, an excellent transfer of knowledge, and farmers have an international mindset and are willing to produce another way. We are very good in the creative industry, gaming, architects, design, etc. We're good in the chemicals, we're good in logistics. So try to define in which sectors you're strong and unite forces. That's what we call top sector policy. Today, we can see a very interesting development. That's what we call triple helix. You know the wording? Triple helix means that if you want to be successful in innovation, and that's at the regional level, you must have the right cooperation between governments, knowledge centers, and businesses. For example, I already mentioned Wageningen University, an agriculture university. That's what we call food valley. In the northern part, we are a gas producing country. In the northern part, we have energy valley because of the knowledge people have over there. The port of Rotterdam, it has been the largest port in the world, now it's the largest in Europe. There you will see a lot of innovation, and that we have a port innovation accelerator. We have consumer electronics, we have smart materials. So the element of working together to have the triple helix construction is very successful. It's the first element. The second element is, I don't know how it's in Singapore, but I spoke about that with the ambassador, the phenomenon of the startups. Are there startups here in Singapore? Of course there must be here. The interesting thing of startups is sometimes they have brilliant ideas. Young guys, if they're starting activities, they're starting company, but you have the problem, they don't have the financial means and they don't have a network. So what you should do is giving room to these startups, support them and lay connections with the bigger companies. That's what we try to do. So that you see a lot of startups in my country and a lot of initiatives. Also my company is involved in that. And the third component that is, I would like to mention that here as well, that's the circular economy. How can you reuse materials? Today, when you talk about cars like Mercedes, I think 96 or 98% of the materials are being reused. That has to do with natural resources. Can we act in another way? So the whole concept of a circular economy is important. The Netherlands will have the presidency of the European Union next year, and then also the circular economy will be high on the agenda. And it also can lead to huge economic advantages if you choose for circular thinking. Ellen MacArthur, she's one of the famous people in the world who was talking and writing about it, the circular economy. So I'm mentioning all these examples. You must have an innovative approach. It is possible to change things, give room to startups, and redefine your activities. I think it's fantastic. Innovation also leads to creativity in organizations. Talk with young people. If you are innovative, that's a good thing. Give room for creativity. And it brings me to my last point. Leadership. So the first point was sustainability and different dimensions. The second was innovation. The last point is leadership. I'm a professor, so I have to refer to some books. Otherwise you're not satisfied. We had a professor and he didn't say anything about books. So I know that risk. And the ambassador knows the story. Ambassador, yesterday I spoke about the book Abundance. Did you remember what I've said? No, thank you. That's it. That's the ambassador. He's a very busy man. It's not. Please tell again. I will mention two books. The first book is of Peter Diamandis. Diamandis is an interesting guy. He's of the Singularity University. He was involved in the second flight to Mars. And Peter Diamandis has written a book about the challenges of today. And he describes we have a lot of difficulties. Hunger, poverty, illiteracy, health, water, etc. And then he analyzed that regarding all these issues, in fact we have so many technical means to find solutions. He said, in fact we have the innovation, the innovative ideas, technical solutions for all these issues. And he describes what these solutions are. You can have production of agriculture in a total other way. Use 5 big apartment buildings in New York and you have enough for the whole city. Then you are using new techniques, new views on illiteracy. How can you tackle this issue? By using new educational methods. He describes them all. And then he said, we have the ideas, we have the tools to find the solutions, but you will see that we will fail. And why? Because there's a lack of good governance. There are too many vested interests, too many traditional views, old-fashioned ways of thinking. That's the reason why you don't make progress. I think it's a fascinating analysis. I can recommend that book. So this is about good governance. And I also would like to mention a second book, Why Nations Fail. Have you heard about it? You know what's the content? What's the message of the book?
That institutions are key in development.
Yeah, institutions are key in development. And what you also read the book? Same?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it was a fascinating book. I gave a speech and I received that book. So I'm at holiday and I've read the book. This book is about 3,000 years world history. And the key question of the two professors, one from Harvard and one from IIT, was under which conditions can a country be successful or not? That's the key question. And after their analysis of 3,000-year world history, in fact they're very clear in their conclusions and recommendations. The first is, if you want to be successful, there must be innovation and creative destruction. Sometimes you have to stop activities in order to create a room for new ways of thinking new products, new services, innovation. That's the first one. The second one is the issue of the rule of law. And the rule of law means no corruption, respect of the intellectual property, a good civil law situation, etc. The rule of law, that's the second component. And the third, that's your point, the role of institutions. And these two authors say you have in fact two kinds of institutions. You have inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. Inclusive institutions mean that people can share in the revenues of economic well-being and economic growth. There is a middle class, that's upward mobility. These are inclusive institutions. Extractive institutions are institutions in which elites, well, they may be communists or capitalists, then they attract all the financial means. No upward mobility, no middle class, etc. So, the view of these authors is, be innovative, respect the rule of law, and have these inclusive institutions. I think it's a fascinating book. And this is about leadership. And if we want to talk about sustainability and innovation, this is also about leadership. And leadership means there must be the willingness to rethink what you're doing, how you have organized things. Years and years ago, in the 80s, when I started working at the think tank of my political party, and I was writing my PhD thesis, there was an American authors, they wrote a book, Reinventing Government. And the issue was, how can you perform in a better way as a government? Reinvent government. There's also a book with the title, Reinventing the Corporation. And in fact, if you talk about sustainability and innovation, the question is, what does that mean for a company, for an NGO, for a university, and for a government, or for governments? I've described the world of businesses. If you really choose for sustainability, that means you have to redefine your business model, your strategy, your key performance indicators, the way you are reporting about activities, the development of new products and services. If you talk about the world of NGOs, and traditionally in the West we've seen that the NGOs were just criticizing governments and companies. The new role could be a partner in a network just to try to find the right agreements, the right solutions. When we talk about universities, I had a nice experience when we had Sustainability Day in the Netherlands. I was speaking with a lot of students, and they said, we demand of the rectors and presidents of universities that sustainability should be integrated in all our curricula. That has to do with education. It also has to do with research programs. If an economist is only talking in the traditional terms of the new classical views or the supply side economics or Keynesian approaches, and you're not willing to talk about institutions, institutional economics, if you're not willing to talk about values and the role of that in economies, trust, etc., and sustainability, then in fact you are a bit old-fashioned. And what I see more among researchers is also talk about role of institutions, the point you mentioned. It's about values. I have the conviction that the 19th century has been the time of the Industrial Revolution. And later on we had a huge social crisis. The 20th century, the second part of it, has been the time of correction via the state, the welfare state. And now we can see that a lot of issues cannot be regulated by the nation state, so you'll see supranational arrangement and at the same moment more decentral solutions. And I think it will be about values. So I think the 21st century will be about values. That's my conviction. And if you talk about reinventing the corporation, reinventing government, reinvent NGOs, reinvent the universities, you must have room for new ways of thinking. I think it's necessary. We need creativity. So, talking about leadership, I think it is about serving society. And that brings me to the end of my contribution here at NUS. It's always interesting to talk about who were people who inspired you. Who inspired you?
Steve Jobs.
Yeah?
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, ja, dat is net you.
Lee Kuan Yew maybe?
Lee Kuan Yew, yeah, you.
You.
You, thank you very much. You?
Pope John Paul.
The Pope, yeah, Pope Jean Paul, yeah.
Buckminster Fuller.
Phil, yeah, yeah. And you? Professor, that's good. He will be very glad. And you?
Also professor.
We can go on with this, but it's always good to just to talk about it, who inspires you. And if you would ask me who inspired you, I would like to mention 3 names. The first name is Gandhi, the Indian leader, and I will explain why. Gandhi was convinced of the power of ideas. And he said, if you have a new idea, in the beginning they will ignore you. Ah, forget it. And then they will laugh about you. Ah. And then they will fight you. And then you will win. So he believed in the power of ideas. And then he also said it's about how can you serve others. And he made a fantastic remark. He said the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. And if we talk about the challenge of this century, this is indeed about serving others. It's about the environment. Can next generations have a good living on this planet? Serve the others. I think it's a very important remark. That's the first person. The second one was Nelson Mandela. You all know him. He's a great South African leader. I had the honor to meet him in 1994. He was just president of South Africa. He's been for a long time in jail. He was a victim of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And when he was released, when he was a free man, he did not talk in terms of another kind of apartheid, but now the other way around. Not white against black, and now black against white. Now he said we need a new South Africa that gives room and a place for everyone, for every human being. That was a beautiful message. And the third one, because I'm here now in Singapore, as you, I would like to mention Lee Kuan Yew. And why do I mention Lee Kuan Yew? 50, 60 years ago, he had his dream for Singapore. And you cannot compare the situation now with then, because so many things occurred. There was a kind of vision. And it's good to talk about who inspires you. You also can listen just to ordinary people. Also they can inspire you. That's my last remark. Have you ever heard about Malta? Malta is a small country, very small country, south of Italy in the Mediterranean. It's our favorite holiday destination. And you have the Isle of Malta, and you also have a smaller Isle of Gozo. And there's a ferry between Malta and Gozo. But if you miss the ferry, you have to wait for an hour. And what happened? Our daughter, she was a kid, she had a classmate, and that classmate was with her family on Gozo, and we stayed on Malta. So I rented a car, a Suzuki Jimny, and at the time I was Prime Minister. And we went to Gozo, we had a fantastic day, and said we must have the ferry of 5:15 in the afternoon. Then we are timely back to have dinner, etc. And what happened? We arrived at 5:10 at the port, the ferry was there, it was open. I thought, we are in time, that's okay. It was a white line. 2 cars were waiting there, and then suddenly a blue French car, a Peugeot, passed us, and he drove to the ferry. And 2 cars in front of me, they were furious. They used a klaxon, what's happening here? And the man who organized the traffic, he said, priority, priority. And the 2 cars were allowed to go to the ferry, and they had to wait for an hour. And then I spoke with the man who organized the traffic. I said, sorry sir, you said something about priority, what do you mean by that? He said, you mean the blue Peugeot? Yes, I mean the blue Peugeot. Yeah, I said, but that was the Minister of Culture. And then I said, but excuse me, do you know who I am? I'm the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And then he started laughing and he said, all people are equal. And he was right. Thank you very much.